University in Jerusalem. During World War II, Mr. Hirschmann was appointed by Mayor LaGuardia to the New York City War Council. He was a special envoy of President Roosevelt in Turkey in 1943 and 1944, and later headed a mission to Turkey where negotiations were consummated for $10 million worth of food for Italy and Greece. Mr. Hirschmann has written articles for Look magazine, Ladies' Home Journal, and the Saturday Review of Literature. His latest work is entitled Red Star over Bethlehem, which is the topic of his lecture today. A question-answer period will follow immediately after the address. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Ira Hirschmann.
Thank you, Mr. Elias. There's a great deal of distortion and misunderstanding about the real major issues and the contestants in the Middle East, hostilities and confrontation. And it is my hope that through my activities in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, in Israel, that I might be able to put the issues in proper perspective. By so doing, giving us a fairer chance of not only knowing the facts, the truth of the issues, directing our interests and sympathies where they belong. If we follow the newspapers, especially in recent months where the issue has catapulted frequently onto the first pages, we would all be inclined to think that this is an incipient new war between the Israelis and the Arabs, and nothing could be farther from the truth. We need only to clarify one point, and that is to know that if the Russians were not in Egypt in force with their missiles, their army, and their propaganda and their support of the Egyptians and control of them, there would certainly be peace in the area today, which would be, of course, something that we would all yearn for. No one could be more ardently in search for peace between those who live in the area. That is the Arabs, the preponderant population, and Israel, the new democratic state, than I. I've spent months in the Arab countries. I think I visited every refugee camp in the Arabs, probably the only person, the only Jew of any position who has done so. And I know the plight of the Arab people. I sympathize with them. I would like to see them back to work. I'd like to see them in a secure position where they can have a chance for the security and independence given to them by God in the first place, as has been given to all of us, including the Israeli. It so happens that I can pinpoint almost the moment when the Russians sprung the door that gave them entrance into the Middle East to become the most dominant force for war or peace in the area. I was in Cairo to represent the U.S. government on a secret mission, and arranged, in fact, to see Abdel Gamal Nasser secretly at his home in Heliopolis, outside of the suburb of Cairo. Our own ambassador at the time was persona non grata with Nasser, who was disturbed by a major situation connected with the U.S. government. When I saw him in his home, a very most attractive man, spoke rather fair English, but very vibrant, very indeed charismatic, if that is the word. We had been scheduled for a 20-minute meeting, secret meeting, and the meeting lasted way beyond an hour because I insisted on directing my own discussions towards efforts at peace in the area instead of his strident remarks against Ben-Gurion, who was then the premier of Israel, and against the Israelis. But in the course of it, he turned his attack, the thrust of his attack, not so much on Israel, but on the United States of America. He said he'd lost confidence in Britain, certainly Great Britain, and in the United States. And then I said, and what about Russia? And, well, he didn't answer. But at any rate, he said that Dulles and Eisenhower had promised him $500 million for major missiles. This was 1955, July. The temperature was about 110 degrees there at the time in his small suburban home, modest home. He said that Dulles and Eisenhower had promised him $500 million worth of missiles for ammunition, major arsenal, and had been stalling. And I said, well, as long as we're talking peace, what do you need to have $1 billion worth of major equipment for? And he said, well, I have to defend myself against the Israelis. I said, well, I can't speak for the Israeli, but I think I can give you assurances that the Israelis have neither the desire nor the means of attacking you, and are looking for peace because they need it even more than you do if their new little democracy is to survive. At any rate, he said, well, they're stalling, Dulles and Eisenhower are stalling. I think I will take this ammunition I'll make a deal with the Russians. I didn't know that he had already made the deal, which a few weeks before that, with Khrushchev, to secure an arsenal via Czechoslovakia. And that was the beginning of the Russian penetration of the Middle East, which was not a new idea. For 250 years, the Russians, and I'm not speaking of the communists or communism here today. I'm speaking about the Russian people and their representatives. The Russians, from back to Catherine the Great, have tried to unfreeze their situation in the north and to drive down to the southern warm water ports. This has been not only a policy but an obsession of the czars that followed one regime after another, and all kinds of deals were made. There was the Crimean War, and even a deal that Stalin, of course, the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact was part of, which is now on the record, was an arrangement for the Russians, in that case the Soviet government, to get Istanbul, which was formerly Constantinople, which has been somehow outside the reach of the Russians for these centuries. And finally, in one moment, the head of the Egyptian government opened that door, and the Russians moved into the position of the Middle East. Now, this is no minor matter. That area or Egypt is certainly the pivot around which any strong power can dominate the entire area. The Middle East is the nerve center of communications between three continents. Airplanes today en route to Africa or Asia must land either at Tel Aviv, Beirut, Cairo, or Istanbul. This is one aspect of the door that connects these continents in that area. But of course, the major one is oil. There is no secret that whatever the other issues are among the Arabs, the Russians and the United States, all other issues are irrelevant compared with oil. The most profitable business that the world has ever known is petroleum, and there's more petroleum in that area of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and recently Libya and Algeria, certainly than any other place in the world. And while the Russians do not need oil for themselves at this time in their history, Europe is propelled by Middle East oil. If the Russians would succeed in controlling the Middle East oil fields, they would succeed in controlling Europe. And it is my view that this is part of their long-range aim. And when you know now that the Russians implanted a $2 billion arsenal eventually in Egypt, which in large effect was destroyed in the so-called Six-Day War in 1967 by the Israeli. As a matter of fact, it was almost a 6-hour war. They destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force in 6 hours. One would have said that the Russians had either learned a lesson or would hesitate in their posture to move from Egypt to control the Middle East. Instead, overnight, a decision was made by the Russian leaders to restore the $2 billion arsenal which the Israeli had destroyed, and not only completely, but also to add to it. And today, the estimate is that that arsenal that is lined up, getting nearer and nearer to the Suez, runs to $3 or $4 billion, and they have some 15,000 so-called advisors. A new term for our lexicography, one that was probably invented by Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy, when he, in an offhand way, stated that he would send some American, quote, advisors over to Vietnam. You now may have some picture of what happens when you begin entering another country with so-called advisors. At any rate, the Russians started with a handful of advisors, just as the Americans did, and now they have 15,000 so-called experts educating and directing the Egyptians in their military operations. This isn't a game of toys. This isn't play. The Russians, whatever else you might say about them, are pragmatists. And if they have a $3 billion arsenal and are training the Egyptians for something or other in the use of these highly calibrated modern instruments, they must be doing so for a purpose other than being a showcase. Now, as you know, recently in the so-called 90-day truce, there was an agreement that neither the armies of the Israeli or the equipment of either the Israeli or the Egyptians would be moved in that period. Incidentally, this truce, as I understand it from Washington, was one that was suggested indirectly by the Russians. They indicated that they would entertain some basis for discussion of peace in the Middle East. And it was picked up by Secretary Rogers, and then the 90-day period was put on it, which was supposed to be, I think, adjusted to the November elections. But at any rate, it was, as you know, completely, the truce was completely betrayed by the Russians. The missiles were moved forward almost within 12 miles of the Suez Canal. And in Washington, I think the reaction was not so much one of dismay and disturbance, but one of a very deeply wounded effect. They felt that they were treated with utter contempt by a major government with whom they were trying to make arrangements to pacify an area that could be a burning cauldron. I make these points to indicate my emphasis and belief that if we are concerned about the movement of events in the Middle East or the efforts to find an area for peace, which is my search, I think we must keep our eyes on the real combatants. And the Russians are not in Egypt for, I think, any other purpose than to dominate the area. I didn't say that they didn't have the right to, if they could buy out the Egyptians or control Egypt or find their way to the oil fields. This becomes a matter of international politics. But I think we ought to know that this is not a battle of Israel versus the Arabs. You have 2.5 million people in this Israel army, vaunted and highly publicized, so-called vital, heroic fighters. But you have a nation of 2.5 million, including infants and children and old people, and there they stand at the Suez on one side and at the Jordan on the other, and down at the Golan Heights, standing up against a population of 90 million Arabs, some rather bloodthirsty terrorists and commandos, and the Russian machine on the other side. Now, that is the picture. It is my belief that in the next months, you will see moves in which the Russians will attempt in one way or another to take over the Suez Canal, or to move down the Suez Canal. Whether they control it completely or whether they open it up is not a question or a matter which I can anticipate. The Suez should be opened since it has been closed since 1967. The Russians are estimated to be losing $500,000 a day with the need of sending their ships around the Cape of Good Hope. The Russians also would like to use it to go into the Persian Gulf and eventually to control that area for the oil, which I have mentioned before. If some reasonable discussions can be held between the parties, there is no reason why the Suez should not be open today. It's what I call a hardened artery. And for the purpose of trade and free operation, the Russian ships should go through, the Israeli ships that have been barred should go through, and any ships could go through. It is, of course, an international waterway. Now, what areas in this realistic picture, what areas do we have that might suggest the possibilities for peace in the situation in which there are certain running sores that should be healed. And I refer to the running sore, the principal running sore, as the Arab refugees. My studies in the Middle East have been engaged mostly in that direction. It was my belief at the very end of the 1947-48 War of Independence of the Israeli that the problem of the Arab refugees would be the pivot around which either war or peace would develop, and I think this is what has really happened. I'm not concerned here with how the refugees got there, how a so-called 500,000 or more than 500,000 refugees have multiplied in their camps and become, according to the Arab governments, about 1 million, or about the 500,000 Jews who were evicted with only their clothes on their back from the Arab countries who had settled in Israel. How this all happened is a part of history. It's certainly one of the melancholy movements, aspects of history with movements of people who should be indigenous and who should have a chance to develop a society with the kind of dignity and security to which they are entitled. The Arab refugees who are said to have fled in the 47-48 war into Arab countries have become charges of international society. The refugees, the Jews who fled or found a haven in Israel immediately became citizens of Israel and almost to a man or woman or child became active workers for a new government that happened to be a democratic system. The Arab leaders, however, made the decision to keep these people in their countries, with the exception of Jordan, without citizenship, and to let them stand and face the world as a showcase of misery and deprivation. This was intended to be a matter of several years. It was right that an international organization, the United Nations, with an arm called UNRWA, U-N-R-W-A, was established to give them temporary assistance and to do what? To put them to work. It was United Nations Relief and Works Administration. Now that name was no accident. They were to be given relief and established in working jobs like all people in all parts of the world, so that they'd be self-supporting and contribute to their society. Instead, the feudal leaders of the Arab countries decided to let them simply float and to be fed and clothed and somewhat educated by a new international instrument called UNRWA. I have visited those camps almost from the beginning and watched it year after year and have made one report after another to the State Department in connection with them. And my reports almost now read like a record. There are variations in the record here and there, but break up these camps, put these people to work, make them self-respecting, self-esteemed citizens, and destroy this fester which will eventually explode in the area. That's exactly what has happened. Unfortunately, like those of you who may have had experience with institutions of any kind, if the people in them remain long enough, they become self-perpetuating. The people who run UNRWA, and you'd be surprised to hear that that is an organization of 18,000 people, And it isn't much when you think of the fact that they are administering to what is called 1 million, or about 1 million people, although it's hard to check and find out how many there are. But there are 18,000 people who've had these jobs for 21 years. And they don't want to give them up, and UNRWA, they do not want UNRWA to stop, because they themselves, the 18,000, would then be out of jobs. They are international servants. They come from all parts of the world. Many of them are Arab refugees who work in the camps. But the leaders who've come from England, Scotland, Holland, all other parts of the world, have established jobs taking care of these indigent people, and to attempt to break up UNRWA is something that none of us have been able to do. Now, the worst part of this is first of all, the whole principle is wrong. You don't let people fester in camps in any country. And it is no fine mark for the Arab leaders that they have people in their own country festering without making a contribution of 1 cent towards their welfare, maybe a few $1,000s here and there. But who pays for this UNRWA administration? Well, there is an international fund, and the people who pay for it are the citizens of the United States of America. 72% of that fund for 21 years has been paid by the United States taxpayers. Now that figure's beginning to come near to $1 billion now. You can figure what could have been done with that money if we had established homes, work centers, vocational centers, and put these people to work. Instead of that, this money has been poured out to this UNRWA organization on the basis of a so-called temporary formula until the people could be absorbed into populations, as they always have in all kind of vast immigration and transplantations of populations. This has happened many times in history, whether it was in Greece or India or any other part. The Armenians somehow, or the Slovakians somehow, or the Sudetans, Germany, they've been absorbed in the areas in which these people had some indigenous relationship. The Arabs are Arabs. They speak Arabic, and the countries they fled to are the ones in which they are certainly more comfortable than they would be in Israel, even the 12% of the Israel population, which is made up of Arabs who are given great freedom in that country. Now, the following, of course, what happened when the new generation grew up out of the refugees, they exploded, which was normal. I saw it coming. You could not. They were incited to hate Israel, to hate anything that was foreign to them, that indicated that they were the victims of this persecution and this unhappy way of life. And so we had the beginning of the commandos, actually begun originally by Nasser with his Fedayeen in about 1955 and 56 when I had my first talk with him. These commandos have developed a number of organizations, not only the one you read about mostly under Arafat, but there are others. There are groups of them. I've met them, I've met some of the leaders and talked very frankly with them in Beirut. They're revolutionaries. They want to break through and principally and I'm not critical of that. They want to principally break through the Hussein's government, his leadership. And we had, just several months ago, there was, as you know, a major civil war where blood ran through the streets of Amman, and which was enough of an explosion to almost to have spread as a conflagration throughout the entire Middle East. It was finally broken up. It was finally settled, at least temporarily, by Abdel Gamal Nasser, which was his last act on earth. He was the only man with enough personality and political force to bring together Arab nations, 14 representatives of Arab nations and the commandos in Cairo. Nasser was really ill and had been ordered to Mersa Matruh, which is a kind of a very attractive seaside resort on the a few miles from Cairo, and was there resting by strict orders from his doctor when he was called to Cairo to attempt to settle this explosive issues between the commandos, King Hussein, and the civil war. It was settled. And if you read carefully the publication of the terms of settlement, which appeared in the New York Times, and which I read carefully, point 14 stated that the Arab governments and the commandos agree to concentrate their armies on the enemy, the principal enemy, which is Israel, instead of against each other. And reports that I received, or I heard in Washington, were to the effect that when they were brought together, Nasser, with his articulateness, and he's a very articulate person, said, "What are we doing? We're killing each other. Arabs are killing Arabs instead of Jews. Our job is to kill Jews. We're killing each other. So let's transfer the bloodshed from Amman to Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem." And suddenly, in what appeared to be rather naively, the Arabs looked at each other and said, "That's right, we're killing the wrong people. So let's all get together and kill the Jews." Now that was published, not in the language that I just used, but in the previous statement. We will consolidate our efforts towards the one common enemy, the Israeli. And then Nasser dropped dead. Now you can make anything you want of that, but it was his last act, and I don't think he will be remembered. He will be immortal for this last momentary rescue and converging the forces, the inciting forces towards Israel to keep the area in a state of eruption. I think he'll be remembered as the man who sprung open the door for the Russians to finally, after 250 years, find their way into the Middle East, to dominate it, not to destroy Israel, which is almost like a mosquito in its way. Israel is an annoyance to the Russians. They would like to go to the Suez and go through and keep on to their business of controlling the warm water ports, and they find this tiny little country in the way. They'd rather get rid of it without having to explode it out of the way or create problems with the United States, because the Russians always back down as soon as they're confronted, which is part of their policy. They don't like to spill their own blood. They get the Czechs to send arms and so forth. But this is where the Russians stand, and this was the principal decision that Nasser made, which I believe is probably the only thing which will give him any place in history, aside from perhaps the fact that he stole the Suez Canal or took the Suez Canal and was then again, of course, put back on the horse by Dulles and Eisenhower in 1956 in a cynical betrayal, which is probably one of the worst pages in the history of American diplomacy. Now, back to the refugees. I believe until a new solution, a new formula is found to replace the sterility and the self-perpetuating mechanism of UNRWA, you will have this seething incitement to war. I believe that the West Bank of Jordan, which is now occupied by the Israelis, should become a separate entity and a separate nation. I favored it 5 days after the war, the '67 war. I was in that area at the American Embassy, and there was a great deal of discussion about establishing a separate entity, a separate nation, or whatever you would call it, for the West Bank. It didn't come off. It was apparently premature, and in fact, there were no leaders in that area, no Jordanians who could take up the cudgel and establish a basic government there. I believe the situation has ripened to a point where that could be a possibility. There are, you may have read something about it or read some rumors about it, but there are quiet discussions being held relating to that possibility. If the refugees and the West Bank Jordans could be consolidated into some new entity, I've suggested call it Palestinia or any such name, and given the assistance and support by the forces, the economic forces that have the subsistence to do so, I think it would go a longer way to establishing a basis for final pacification of the area than any of the strident talk we hear or any of the sterile efforts at the United Nations or any confrontations that you see by the Arab commandos or by the Russians or any other group. I have been involved in a program, in a plan, which was initiated in principle back in 1958 when Nasser tried to capture Lebanon and the United States sent its Marines to the shores of Lebanon, which established some equilibrium in that area at that time. It seemed to me that there was an opportunity then to bring these refugees into some position where they could be established as a separate self-sustaining entity. And I suggested that the oil companies, the oil interests, who are cashing in literally billions of dollars, pledge themselves to contribute a half cent a barrel from the oil produced towards a central fund which would be to be maintained by an independent international authority, probably a Middle East Economic Authority, I called it, sustained by individuals throughout the world who are respected, and this fund be used to establish an entirely new community in that area, and also including some of the Sinai Desert. But plans have been drawn up with housing and waterways and a whole basic civilization, as was done down in Brasilia, which was a forest that was cut into to make a capital of Brazil. This can be done, and this is a a plan that caught the imagination of the oil interests only in their own selfish concern at the time, and which is being revived for consideration. I mentioned that to you today in the most informal way. I don't think it is a program that's been crystallized in any formal sense, but it is an indication of what might be done. I think a major contribution to that fund could be made by the United States, by Israel, and by other countries in order at last to bring about a construction of the area and infuse new life into the people of that section. I think also that it is time that the United States developed a realistic approach to its own position in the area, that its ambivalence in standing aside and permitting the Russians to gradually move in and take over the dominance of the area, which they have done not only in Egypt, but through their alliance with Iraq and Syria and Libya, which is producing 1 billion barrels of oil a day. I think the United States should take a position of determining what its selfish interests are there. Not for Israel, if you please. This is not the purpose of the U.S., and it's not their obligation to go and defend Israel in any sense. Yes, it is a democracy, and there are certain relationships that are justified, and the U.S. citizens and the U.S. have contributed in large measure to the continued subsistence of the state of Israel. But I think the time has come now where the U.S. should make its position strong and stand up against the Russians. Otherwise, you will see a red star over Bethlehem. I thank you.
We have time for some questions now. Are there any questions? Yes.
Given that what we have in the camps, in the production of an alienated class that has no other function but destruction, no other ideology except such principles as glory or revenge. What we have here is actually a sort of sick warrior class produced. Now, do you expect these people to accept sanity, to accept peaceful economic endeavors? Can you really seriously think that there can be peace with these individuals?
I think there must be peace. I think the history of all upheavals and based on divisions of people's ideology and attitudes, incitement to riot, incitement against so-called rivals, has, in almost all cases that we know of, and we can refer to our recent history, have eventually been pacified by major contributions to put people to work. I proved, and I will not go into detail here, but I made the point, and I think it answers you, and that is that if the oil interests would put a tool in the hands of these Arabs and teach them how to use them with vocational schools in the Arab camps in the Arab countries, these people would forget their animosities and they would forget their deep wounded concern about themselves and their families. They'd get to work for subsistence and for the satisfaction of using their hands in some constructive way. And I was responsible for the developing of the United Nations vocational schools in which Arabs got diplomas for their physical work and were given jobs in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, What my aim now would be to give these people homes that were sanitary, decent, they pay about $1 a month according to the plan, and would eventually own the home and give their children a chance for the proper kind of schooling, not UNRWA schooling, which incites them to attack the Israeli, but to give them schooling on the broad academic free basis. And these people, once they get to work and see their neighbors working and see the values of dignity and freedom, these people, like other people in the world, would become self-sustaining citizens.
Yes.
You mentioned that you feel the solution to the refugee problem would be to set up an independent state, calling it Palestine. Well, why should the Israeli government do this in a sense, since if they would set up a state based on these refugees, and you admit that the terrorists are the new generation of the refugees, what is to assure the Israeli government that they won't use this as a stepping stone to further attack Israel?
There are no assurances. And there never are assurances. No assurances that the Russians won't attack the Israeli or any other thing. We only know that the situation as it is will become more explosive in its present condition, not less. And the only opportunity, the only solution that I see is to give these people a normal life, and for Israel to take the chance on the possibility that these people might rise up and become militarists. I have my questions about that. The Israeli have learned by now to be very realistic. I think for the Israeli to deal with a society that is attempting to resurrect itself and is financed to build itself has a better chance than to have terrorists or areas, breeding areas of terrorism around them. The Arabs in Jordan and in many of the camps are not all terrorists. There are minority groups that have risen up and organized for opposition, which is understandable. We are trying to counteract that by taking the preponderant number of people and putting them to work in giving them back their self-respect. I'll answer two more questions.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Yes, these two.
If UNRWA is so ineffective, why doesn't the U.S. cut off funds?
That's a very good question. I've recommended that be done several times. You're dealing, first of all, with a very strong Arab lobby. You're dealing with U.S. relationships with Arab countries as well as with Israel. It is felt, they felt from year to year in a delaying action. Every year they said, well, let's try it one more year. There was no substitute plan offered to take up the slack where UNRWA left off. And until such a plan is introduced and invoked, they've continued as I guess, the course of least resistance.
Yes. We'll take a question here.
Only so-called strong position on the part of the United States will this now lead to direct conflict and war with Russia?
That's a very good last question. I think on the contrary, it won't. In every instance where the United States has stood its ground and stood firm against Russian encroachment or Russian aggression, the history, and we must be guided by what has happened, the history has been that the Russians have stepped back. They may rise another time. They did so in the Berlin airlift. They did so when President Truman acted swiftly and created the Marshall Plan and saved Turkey and Greece from Soviet-inspired revolts. They did so in 1953. They backed down when Eisenhower established the airlift and Berlin was saved. They backed down in 1958 when we sent U.S. Marines to Lebanon. They backed down in Cuba when Khrushchev had sent his missiles 90 miles from the shores of the U.S. They backed down in 1967 when President Johnson gave the hint to them on the hotline that he would not permit an intervention by the Russians in the June 1967 war. And the question now is whether they would not back down once the U.S. indicated that it would stand its ground in that area. President Nixon stood on the Saratoga, a member of the Sixth Fleet, during the time of the war in Jordan, as a symbol of the Sixth Fleet's power in that area, which the Russians have challenged with its own highly developing fleet. It is my conviction that the Russians are pragmatic enough to avoid a head-on confrontation with the United States, which it has done in every instance. And I have read some of them off, and I believe they would do it in the Middle East if we stood firm, which is power is only power when it shows its force of power. I thank you.
Thank you very much.